Thank you very much, Tom, and thanks for the invitation to be here. Thanks for your help, and thanks to Pat Hinchcliffe, to the Jesuit community, and to the people who support this initiative and make it possible. I left Rome yesterday, and I actually missed something which I always like going to each year, which is, yesterday is a free day in Italy. No one works. Well, no one works any day in Italy, in fact, but especially yesterday, because the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, the Pope Benedict goes down to the Spanish Steps, and there's a wonderful statue of the Virgin Mary on a high pedestal. But I always like going there after the crowds have left, because as well as the flowers and various things, there's always a lot of cartons of milk for the baby Jesus. I just find it's the fascinating human side of Italian Catholicism. Anyway, I've never been here before, so it's great to be in Holy Cross, and it's an honor to talk to you. And I'm going to try and show some images as we go along. Recently, I've been mulling over a striking thought from the Worcester-born poet Stanley Kunitz, who grew up locally and I believe was twice U.S. Poet Laureate. He died 5 years ago. He was an avid gardener, and he said once in an interview, "One of my feelings about working the land is that I am celebrating a ritual of death and resurrection. Every spring I feel that. I am never closer to the miraculous than when I am grubbing in the soil." I am never closer to the miraculous than when I am grubbing in the soil. This phrase in turn reminded me of a poem by the Irish Nobel Prize-winning poet Seamus Heaney, an old poem of his called Digging, where he muses that just as his fathers and forefathers were skilled with the spade and used to dig in these turf bogs, so he with his pen is, quote, going down and down for the good turf, digging. So this is what I'm trying to do today. I'm trying to grub in the soil like Stanley Kunitz, or dig and probe with my words, trying to unearth something helpful from Catholic beliefs and practices worldwide. I use those metaphors of digging and grubbing deliberately because just as in organizational culture, there's a deep cultural substratum, the operative culture of a business, that is often hidden below the surface and which may differ radically from the ideal culture espoused in explicit mission statements. So too, when it comes to faith, I think we have to dig deep down to those layers in order to recognize the fundamental assumptions that inform our belief and practice. For instance, the basic stance of trust or mistrust, which underlies our asking God for a favor in prayer. So I've been asked today to talk about reimagining Catholic theology in the light of Catholic belief and practice worldwide. The word Catholic, as you know comes from those two Greek words, kata holos, according to the whole. So etymologically, at least, to be Catholic means to be universal. I like this. This reminds me of the space shuttle, this church in Reykjavik in Iceland. So thinking of space shuttles and cosmos and universality. To be Catholic means ideally to embrace the world in all its plurality and fullness. And although it does emerge from Judaism, Christianity, of course, didn't define itself in ethnic terms, because although Christians were people of the covenant, they universalized the covenant. And essential to the identity of Christians from the very beginning was to be global, as distinct from the Jewish people. Of course, there are other big differences. But the prophet Isaiah has a vision of all nations turning to the Jews, and Christianity often sees itself as contributing to this prophetic revelation. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. Isaiah chapter 2. So for that reason, the expression, I believe in the Holy Catholic Church in the Apostles' Creed is really about this universality, because the canvas of Catholicism is a vast canvas, and it does embrace, as we've heard especially from our students just now, the stunning diversity of Catholic beliefs and practices. And there's something analogous in your own country. I'm often struck that on the seal of many of the documents of the federal government of the United States, you have a pluribus unum, out of many, one. And there's a sort of a give and take relationship between diversity and unity. So, turning for a moment to local expressions of our universal faith, it's important to ask, why should we pay attention to the cultural diversity of Catholicism around the world today? Well, the answer for me goes something like this, that faith is the fruit of revelation, and this fruit is always received in a cultural context. Faith, our hesitant and unsteady yes to God's prior steady, faithful yes, is culturally received. I'm talking about culture here in the sense of the hidden and taken for granted assumptions that inform our ways of thinking, our ways of acting. And Thomas Aquinas said something to that effect many centuries ago. He said, "Quid recipitur ad modum recipientis recipitur," which, as you all know, means whatever is received into something is received according to the condition of the recipient. So culture affects how we believe, or as the contemporary Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor puts it, we have to trace the development of our modern outlooks. And since we are dealing not just with philosophers' doctrines, but also with the great unsaid that underlies widespread attitudes in our civilization, the history can't be one of express belief, of philosophical theories, but must also include what has been called mentalities. The great unsaid. I really love that expression, because for me, so much of our lives and cultures are not explicitly expressed, yet they continually sway our worldviews, which is why I've put an iceberg here as an image. So we have to go beneath the surface, beneath the visible level, to open up those hidden layers of disposition and feeling. Anyway, let's go back to the big picture. So I'm daring to reimagine Catholic theology with the help of all these Catholic beliefs and practices worldwide. So it makes sense for me to say briefly what I understand Catholic theology to entail. I've mentioned the etymological origin of the word Catholic in universal, and so therefore it makes sense to embrace or approach Catholicism from as wide a perspective as possible. And medieval Christian thinkers used the terms unity, truth, goodness, beauty as synonyms for being. These words, goodness, truth, unity, and beauty, harbor tremendous power, the very power of being, for they can be applied to anything. They're seen as interchangeable with being, inseparable companions of being. And so Catholic theology, with its sacramental vision of reality as permeated by God's presence, radically affirms goodness, truth, beauty, and unity wherever it finds them. And that's why I chose this rainbow color of houses from a small Italian town. Because I think those terms, truth, unity, goodness, beauty, can hold Catholic theology together without at the same time having to compromise diversity. They are capable of revealing it, if you like, as a single tapestry made up of many different colors. At the level of thought, for example, theology is a quest for truth. The famous expression of St. Anselm, whose feast day we celebrated just a few days ago, faith-seeking understanding. And that's at the level of thought. At the level of action, theology can help improve our personal and social lives, and therefore it's a quest for goodness. Aristotle says at the very beginning of his Ethics, every craft, every line of inquiry, every action, every decision seeks some good. And he says that's why people were right to describe the good as what everything seeks. At the level of beauty, Catholic theology can remind us of the importance of an aspect of our experience of God that easily falls into forgetfulness, namely the fact that God's self-revelation can overwhelm us with the kind of delightful surprise that is akin to our experience of great art. Theology can deepen our prayer lives, can embellish our worship of an endlessly beautiful and attractive God. And finally, at the level of unity or oneness, Catholic theology seeks to integrate different elements into a whole. And the more elements a thing possesses, the stronger the unity it needs to hold them together. And Catholic theology, with such a wide universal sweep, needs an especially coherent unity. So summing up, I could say that Catholic theology pursues truth, goodness, beauty, and unity. And we can't ultimately separate these at a practical level, even though right now at a conceptual level I've tried to distinguish them. So not only am I going to highlight 4 qualities, I'm also going to refer to 3 geographical places. Using wordplay and homophony, I could call them 3 eyes, 3 ways of seeing, 3 perspectives, because each of these nations' names begins with the letter I. Ireland, Israel, and Italy. Why talk about Ireland, Israel, and Italy in particular? Because I've lived in each of them. I've lived in Ireland for 40 years. I've lived in Italy for 9 years. I've lived in Israel for a year. And as well as talking about these 3 countries where I have personal experience and which can give my reflections a personal tone, I'm also going to refer, of course, to the global south. And it's interesting when you picture the Earth from space, you see how enormous, for example, Africa really is, and how small Europe appears to be. And that's where 2/3, of course, of Catholics, as Tom explained to us at the beginning today live. And it's where most of the students at the Gregorian University come from. They come from 125 different nations, but most of them come from the global south. So let me talk about truth, and then goodness and unity, and then beauty, taking each time a country as an example. So truth. I want to look at a creative new practice emerging in Catholic faith today, authorized by no one less than the present Pope. A practice which I believe could purify Catholic theology in its perennial quest for truth. On October the 27th, 2011, just little over 5 weeks ago, the Pope went with a large group of religious leaders on an interreligious pilgrimage to Assisi. And a month previously, on September the 25th, 2011, in Freiburg im Breisgau in Germany, Pope Benedict praised genuinely searching agnostics, maintaining that they were closer to the kingdom of God than routine believers. In other words, the Pope was recognizing the possible authenticity of unbelievers and the possible lack of authenticity of believers. And when he went to Assisi in October, Benedict XVI concluded his speech by making a crucial contrast between a closed atheism that is full of hostility and contempt and an open agnosticism which seeks the truth. And I quote his words here: "The growing world of agnosticism, people to whom the gift of faith has not been given, but who are nevertheless on the lookout for truth, searching for God. Such people do not simply assert there is no God. They suffer from God's absence, and yet are inwardly making their way toward God, inasmuch as they seek truth and goodness. They are pilgrims of truth, pilgrims of peace. They ask militant atheists to leave polemics aside and to become seekers. They also challenge the followers of religion not to consider God as their own property. They are seeking the true God, whose image is frequently concealed in the religions because of the ways in which they are often practiced. So all their struggling and questioning is in part an appeal to believers to purify their faith." End of quotation. So we believers can fail through seeing God as our possession, through viewing religion as an anchor of security instead of as a source of transformation. By contrast, open and authentic agnostics seek the truth, seek the true God. Unfortunately, religious beliefs and practices can impede the authentic search of these agnostics. The existence of unbelief, the honest struggles and questionings of non-believers are an invitation to believers to purify their own faith. And this issue the Pope was touching on that is a big preoccupation for him, the complex issue of secularization. It's not just a Western phenomenon. One of my students, Annie Humphrey Uchenna, a priest from Nigeria, Africa, he's writing a thesis with me, a master's thesis on the phenomenon of secularization in eastern Nigeria. And in the 1970s, for example, he was telling me the mission schools in the whole of eastern Nigeria were taken over by the government, and this led to the exclusion of any religious program in the school curriculum, also the prohibition of wearing religious medals in many schools, and the way of the cross, which used to be an integral part of school life during Lent, is no longer a custom. And there are now different atheistic groups in Nigeria, which would have been unheard of a generation ago. So there's different ways, obviously, of responding to the phenomenon of secularization and unbelief. I believe Pope Benedict XVI has chosen a really imaginative response. The American poet and theologian Amos Wilder, who died in 1993, wrote something really striking on this. I quote, "It is at the level of the imagination that the fateful issues of our new world experience must first be mastered. It is here that culture and history are broken, and here that the church is polarized. Old words do not reach across the new gulfs, and it is only in vision and oracle that we can chart the unknown and new name the creatures." I believe Benedict is reaching across one of those critical new gulfs of our time, the gulf between belief and unbelief, a chasm, in fact, which runs through each one of us, if we're honest. As the Roman centurion says, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." His is also a positive stand that it builds on a whole tradition of outreach to atheists already visible in Vatican II. It's fascinating that when it comes to the issue of the salvation of unbelievers, Vatican II was silent about the question of culpability. Instead, it spoke in terms of the failure to perceive love. And so I believe Benedict is modeling a daring new Catholic practice to which we're all invited to dialogue with unbelievers, to share with them in a genuine way. How can this enrich Catholic theology? I think it can enrich it by helping us to envisage Catholic theology in a humble way as apophatic, a theology that gropes its way by night rather than dominating with the clear vision of the day. In other words, by acknowledging God's infinite profundity, inexhaustible richness, we also confess that despite God's self-revelation in Jesus Christ, our theology can never ultimately fathom the divine riches. We acknowledge that our ultimate response to God is not the grasp of knowledge, but the humility of being grasped. We recognize that paradoxically the divine mystery grows with increasing revelation, just like listening to a fugue by Bach. We can never quite plumb the depths. So it is analogously with God. Thomas Aquinas, whom I quoted earlier, stopped working on his massive Summa a few months before he died in March 1274. When asked why he had given up, he explained that compared to what God had just revealed to him and what he had seen, all that he had written seemed like so much straw. It's no accident that Charles Taylor, in his monumental book, A Secular Age, discusses the English Jesuit poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, because as an example of how we can cope with the secularized world today, There's a Hopkins Society, a vibrant Hopkins Society in Ireland, and this man was talking at the Hopkins Society in May, and in November he became president of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins. Anyway, there is the example of his life, of a life of someone like Gerard Manley Hopkins, shows that all believers undergo periods of doubt, dark nights of the soul. Unfortunately for Gerard Manley Hopkins, most of his dark nights of the soul seem to transpire in Dublin, Ireland. I'll have more to say about Ireland shortly. But anyway, he gives voice to this troubling sense of spiritual desolation in his poetry. For example, that poem, No Worst, begins with those despairing words, no worst there is none, pitched past pitch of grief. But crucially, his dark nights were followed by the return of light and day. The grace and gift of faith came back, and he enjoyed it perhaps in a fuller and humbler way because he was more aware that it was not his possession or right. Or take, for example, the completely new angle we've discovered in 2007 on Mother Teresa of Calcutta, with the publication of a book chronicling her decades-long experience of darkness and faith. You come across extraordinary declarations in those diaries, like, I quote, "There is no God in me." Of course, there's a crucial difference between Gerard Manley Hopkins and Mother Teresa of Calcutta on the one hand, and many people in our secularized world on the other, because in the case of Hopkins and Mother Teresa, that emptiness is inner and spiritual in nature. In the case of many of our secularized contemporaries, it can be also caused, or predominantly caused, by social, intellectual factors. But I took those examples too of Hopkins and Mother Teresa of Calcutta because I believe poetry and the imagination, as in Hopkins, are crucial on the road back to belief. And I believe that Mother Teresa's example shows us that it's not through complicated intellectual gymnastics that we will recover faith after desolation, but through a humble faithfulness to the mystery of the everyday, to living out something which we cannot entirely make rational sense of. So they point us towards a theology that is hospitable to poetry, to mystery, and in the case of Mother Teresa, to an act of love as the only effective antidote to the gaping hole we often feel inside. So that was on truth. Let me now turn to goodness and unity. Here I want to speak mainly about Ireland, where current troubling issues in Catholic belief can spur Catholic theology to think in a more demanding way about goodness and unity. But before turning to zone in on Ireland, let me say a few words about the larger picture. Obviously, there's huge injustice and suffering in our world today, which is why theology is often reminded to remember that it is based, as the German theologian Johannes Baptist Metz says, it's based on a dangerous or subversive memory, the remembrance of Christ crucified. And so it's challenged to view the world from the perspective of victims in order to help to create a better world for victims through its thinking. A good friend of mine, Father Peter Lejac, who's as well as a doctor, he's a medical priest, he's a Maryknoll missionary. He spent 17 years working in Tanzania. This is a Tanzanian woman with her child. He told me that while Christmas is the most celebrated day most celebrated Catholic holiday in the USA, in Tanzania, Good Friday is the day of the year which traditionally has the most Catholics in attendance in church, even more so than Easter. The Tanzanians, during a drought, AIDS epidemics, the Rwandan war, told them that Good Friday is the day on which their suffering is experienced by Christ. So they believe that Christ understands their suffering, gives meaning to it when they combine their own suffering with his. Incidentally, they also say that the USA is a land that is more like Easter because it is like heaven on earth. And it's interesting, in Tanzania, Christmas is a minor religious holiday. There's no Christmas cards or gifts, and of course there's no evergreens, so there are no Christmas trees. So it would be easy to name many, many other examples of suffering from around the world and the unique Catholic practices to which they give rise. But let me focus on a stark example from Ireland. I want to talk about something that was adverted to in Professor Orsi's question. It's the terrible crime of clerical sex abuse, which has led to a profound rethinking of Catholic belief and practice among the people of Ireland. I've chosen this ruined house in Connemara, this ruined stone house, purpose as a metaphor for a sense of desolation in the Catholic Church of Ireland. The contemporary crisis in Ireland began with the resignation of the Bishop of Galway, Eamon Casey, in 1992, when it was discovered that he had fathered a child with an American divorcee. At the time, this news created a huge scandal, but in the wake of almost 20 years of horrific revelations of child abuse that have followed, Bishop Casey's wrongdoing now seems almost innocuous by comparison. But long before these clerical crimes and cover-ups came to light, there were already serious problems in Irish Catholicism, at least from the end of the Great Famine in 1852 onwards. There was a tendency in Ireland to enforce a petty vision of goodness, confined largely to external rules and narrow morality. It seems the Irish church leadership forgot or failed to proclaim that faith is about life in all its fullness, that universality of which I spoke at the beginning. It's not about penalizing people for being happy. As Frank McCourt wrote in Angela's Ashes, "What are we to give up when we have Lent all year long?" In an interview with the Paris Review, another Irish writer, Edna O'Brien, speaks of what she calls the hounding nature of Irish Catholicism. She says, I quote, "Everything was an occasion for fear. Religion was force-fed the way they feed the geese of Strasbourg for pate. I feel I'm a cripple with a craving for wings," unquote. No wonder Brendan Behan says, "Other people have a nationality. The Irish and the Jews have a psychosis." The Irish clergy is already strongly criticized in a famous Irish novel published almost 100 years ago in 1916. I quote from this novel. John," he said, "it's true for them. We're an unfortunate priest-ridden race and always were and always will be till the end of the chapter." Dante broke in angrily. "If we are a priest-ridden race, we ought to be proud of it. They are the apple of God's eye, God and religion before everything." Dante cried, "God and religion before the world." Mr. Casey raised his clenched fist and brought it down on the table with a crash. "Very well then," he shouted hoarsely. "If it comes to that, no God for Ireland." I'm sure you'll recognize this extract is from the famous Christmas dinner scene of a portrait of the artist as a young man. That's a statue. The reason this looks so lovely is it's not a statue of Joyce from Ireland, but from Trieste in Italy, where he spent 15 years. That's why everything looks so happy. Anyway, the exclamation from Mr. Dedalus at the beginning of that extract I find very telling. Listen again. He says, "We are an unfortunate priest-ridden race and always were and always will be till the end of the chapter." Well, today, practically a century later, I feel that we have arrived at the end of that chapter. The chapter has closed suddenly and abruptly with the dramatic meltdown of Irish Catholicism. Now, there's a lot more that could be said about this recent and sudden collapse of faith in Ireland. But here, what I want to focus on for the purposes of this talk is how this cataclysmic shift in Irish Catholic belief and practice can challenge Catholic theology at the level of goodness. And let me note in passing that goodness is not a form of terminal niceness that is safely cocooned from the wounded world we inhabit. Goodness has guts and grit. I really love the words of the saintly monk Zosima. He says it to a well-intentioned lady who loves humanity in abstract, but no one in particular in the novel, Dostoevsky's novel, The Brothers Karamazov. He says to her, "Love in action is a harsh and dreadful thing compared to love in dreams." So there should be zero tolerance for the kind of Christianity that turns a deaf ear to to the suffering of human beings. Because the Christian God is not that kind of indifferent God. Although, interestingly enough, the very same James Joyce, later in that very same semi-autobiographical novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, he castigates God for being indifferent and caring, comparing the artist to God. He says, and I quote, "The artist, like the God of creation, remains within or behind or beyond or above his handiwork, invisible, refined out of existence, indifferent, paring his fingernails." We need a Catholic theology with a large canvas, generous horizons, a theology that celebrates the fully alive human being as the glory of God, as St. Irenaeus puts it, a theology that is alert to God's presence in the world, instead of limiting God to a narrow range of predictable issues. A contemporary Irish writer, Marion Keyes, clarifies what this narrow band of tired Catholic practices is in the following mother-daughter exchange in one of her novels. "All that praying you made us do," complained Maggie, "and making us go to Mass and starving us on Good Friday, and making us feel ashamed of our bodies and guilty about absolutely everything. No, Ma, you were the pits." Nuala glowed with pride. Truly, she had been the best of Catholic mothers. It's from Late Opening at the Last Chance Saloon. So Catholic, Professor Rowena Robinson already referred to David Tracy, the Chicago-based theologian. I think Catholic theology has to recover what the title of his famous book calls the analogical imagination. It has to discover and underline God's presence in the world. The fact that, as Jared Manley Hopkins puts it, the world is charged with the glory of God. It needs to learn from the disenchantment of the Irish people and of Catholics elsewhere in the world. As I mentioned, in the case of Ireland, the scandal of abuse, although horrific, is not the sole cause of the crisis of Irish faith. The larger pattern to which I'm pointing is the long-standing tendency of Irish Catholic leadership, and perhaps also even the Irish media, to rob Catholicism of its universal scope by confining attention to a limited number of issues, such as questions of sexual morality, statements by the Pope, the relationship between church and state. I'll give you a concrete example. I don't believe I've ever heard a homily by a fellow Catholic priest in which he's given the congregation practical advice and tips about how to pray, which is one reason I co-wrote a book on prayer this year. Whatever happened to Catholic spirituality? According to a recent Pew Forum study in the United States, the three biggest religious groups in the USA are Catholics, Baptists, and ex-Catholics. Roughly half of those who leave Catholicism abandon religion altogether. The other half switches denominations. Of those who go to other denominations, what are their principal reasons for moving? Are they because of scandals, abuse, women's issues? These are certainly factors, but they're not actually the main or predominant factors. In fact, most claim the reason they're leaving Catholicism is that they're not being spiritually nourished by the Catholic Church. Catholicism is about everything. It's universal. It embraces the whole world. And I believe it's really tragic to see it reduced to parochial proportions. And ironically, at the same time that Catholicism is being squeezed and squeezing itself into a narrow ghetto of insular concerns, other and immeasurably narrower explanations of reality, such as consumerism, scientism, sport, are claiming to offer all-embracing answers to human beings. For example, sport promises purpose and meaning to millions of human beings. It has its gods and superstars, its halls of fame. It has its own liturgies with characteristic vestments and rituals. And just as the church's liturgical season reaches its apex at Easter, the American football season reaches its liturgical climax with the Super Bowl. its many symbols proclaiming its faith, for instance, the bats, the gloves, the game balls, and baseball. And here we've got a boy in Nicaragua dreamingly gazing from behind the dugout as his home baseball team play. As a result, instead of turning to faith at crucial transitional points in their lives, many Catholics and many others now seek vitality and direction in the reassuring rhythm of the sporting season. So the new challenges emanating from Ireland and elsewhere are a summons to re-envisage Catholicism not as a litany of laments, not as nostalgia for a bygone age, but as a truly universal faith that stands on the threshold of possibility and promises us that the best is yet to come. Let me turn now to beauty. One point I highlighted just now regarding Irish Catholicism was its straightened and external approach. In reality, this is an aberration of true Catholicism because Catholicism has huge horizons. Religion is an affair of the heart, not just of the head. They say there's a distance of 15 inches between the head and the heart, but sometimes it can take a whole life to get from one to the other. And one of the most attractive elements of Catholicism in the global south, I believe, where Catholicism is most vibrant, is that it does touch the heart there in a simple yet profound way. One of my students, Sister Laura Cantoni, is an Italian nun, missionary sister of the Immaculate. She's doing graduate studies in missiology right now at the Gregorian University. But from 2001 to 2010, she lived in the Amazon rainforest in Brazil, among a rural community of indigenous people in a remote area between the city of Manaus, which is 1,203 miles from the capital, Brasilia, and between that city of Manaus and the city of Parintins, which is 260 miles away from Manaus. So it's anyway, she described to me how the local people have a really strong positive sense of the body, of its naturalness. They're strongly tactile. For instance, they do more than just receive communion. They believe in the power of the sacred host to obtain graces, to free them from physical and psychological ailments. They like to bring the host home for the sick, to give it to children, adolescents who are experiencing difficulties. They express their faith, too, with their whole being. They worship with their bodies, moving to the rhythm of the music as they sing, like the Brazilian people here in a parish in Boston that we've heard about. So theirs is not so much a rational faith as is ours in the West. It's a faith of music, dance, celebration, joy, concrete signs and symbols. But to focus in on this area of beauty in a more deliberate way, let me talk about Israel. From 2008 to 2009, I lectured at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. This is a good friend, Professor Bruria Biton Ashkeloni, who actually is an expert on pilgrimages, which is an area that has come up and been mentioned today. But anyway, while in Jerusalem, I met a tiny and most unusual group of Catholics. They're unique in global terms. The Hebrew-speaking Catholics. As you know, the total Christian population of Israel is minuscule, 2.1% Christians, about 150,000 people. And Hebrew-speaking Catholics make up a tiny proportion of this tiny percentage of the Christian population. Some of them are from a Jewish background, but many are the children of immigrant workers, for example, of Filipino nurses and care workers. There's no Catholic school system in Israel. Hebrew language catechisms for children have only begun to be published for the first time in the last few years. So whether Jewish in origin or culturally Jewish, these Hebrew-speaking Catholics are often more familiar with the Jewish faith out of which Christianity developed than they are with Christianity itself. So there's a great beauty for Hebrew-speaking Catholics in being immersed in the Jewish roots of Christianity. This is a wonderful, The White Crucifixion by Marc Chagall, and you can see how he wraps Jesus in a Jewish prayer shawl, and the symbols of Jewish persecution, pogroms over the centuries, surround the cross. So the universal Catholic Church only really woke up to the importance of its Jewish roots with the historical Declaration Nostra Aetate of Vatican II, promulgated in 1965. So my question is, how can the beliefs and practices of these Hebrew-speaking Catholics enrich Catholic theology today? They can enrich Catholic theology in three ways. First, they remind us that Jesus, his apostles, and most of the early Christians were Jewish. I remember a story of an Irish priest giving a retreat to some Irish nuns. And the first day he was talking to them and he says, well, sisters, I just like to say that, well, we're Catholics and, the latest scholarship shows we're come from the Jewish roots and the Jewish faith. And the nuns nodded complacently and gladly. And then the second day he says, well, today I just like to talk about Jesus. Jesus, in fact, was also Jewish and grew up Jewish and went to the synagogue, and they nodded appreciatively and so on. And the third day he says, and today now I'd like to speak about the Virgin Mary. She was Jewish. And a sister put up her hand and says, it's okay with the Catholic Church and Jesus, but no, not the Virgin Mary. So anyway, this reminds us, these Hebrew-speaking Catholics remind us that Jesus, the Virgin Mary, the first apostles, and most of the early Christians were Jewish. They also remind us how much we owe to Judaism. And thirdly, they help reinforce the growing positive relationship that's been developing between Christians and Jews for the last, since 1965. In fact, I'm flying back to Rome tomorrow because I invited over the Chief Rabbi of Great Britain, Lord Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, to speak at the Gregorian, and he's arriving on Sunday, and he's meeting the Pope on Monday morning, and he's giving a keynote lecture called Has Europe Lost Its Soul on Monday evening at the Gregorian. So anyway, these aspects of our faith are kind of a luxury or an optional extra for many Catholics, the fact that we're rooted in Judaism. But for Hebrew-speaking Catholics, the culture of Judaism is a key formative influence in the way they live. Unfortunately, many Christians are ignorant of the importance of Judaism for Christianity. In fact, they're also ignorant of the Bible, especially Catholics. There's an interesting exchange in the first act of Samuel Beckett's play, Waiting for Godot, where Vladimir and Estragon, the two tramps, are speaking, and Vladimir says, "Did you ever read the Bible?" And Estragon replies, "The Bible? I must have taken a look at it." I think many Catholics could probably say much the same as Estragon when it comes to the Bible. Yeah, I must have taken a look at it. But they have little familiarity with this book of books. So let me take one simple example from the Bible itself by way of illustrating how a retrieval of our Jewish roots could enrich Christianity. My example is the prayer that over 1 billion Catholics, 1 billion Christians recite, some every day, many repeatedly in the course of their lifetimes. It's prayed at the Roman Catholic Mass just before receiving Holy Communion. It's a prayer that Jesus himself taught his disciples, a prayer that summarizes the whole message of salvation. I'm referring, of course, to the Our Father. And I have two Filipino girls praying here because there are many Filipino Catholics in Israel. Although we rarely advert to the fact, the truth is that the Our Father is a thoroughly Jewish prayer. First of all, it was a Jew called Jesus of Nazareth who taught it. And we find two almost identical versions in Scripture in Matthew and in Luke. Not only was Jesus a Jew, he was also teaching this prayer to Jews in their language and within their cultural context. Second, like all Jewish prayers, it's not individualistic, but communal in nature. The opening words are not my Abba, but our Father. And it continues, give us our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive. Lead us not into temptation. Deliver us from evil. You know, it's extraordinary when you think about it. At that moment when Jesus was asked to teach his disciples to pray, the world was on the threshold of a new religion called Christianity. Jesus, as the founder of Christianity, could have taught any number of prayers. He could have taught a prayer that would have been specifically Christian in language and intent. But instead, he taught them a prayer that any Jew can pray. There's not a single expression or even a single word in this prayer, according to Jewish friends, that goes against the Jewish faith. Over the centuries, certainly there's been a difficult and troubled relationship between Christians and Jews. Sadly, many times Christians have wrongly accused Jews of being cursed by God. The present Pope, significantly a German Pope, radically disagrees. He sees the Jewish people as especially close to God. Speaking, in fact, at Auschwitz concentration camp on the 28th of May 2006, Pope Benedict XVI said that by seeking to eliminate the Jews, the Nazis were also trying to kill God. I quote, "Deep down, those vicious criminals, by wiping out this people, wanted to kill the God who called Abraham, who spoke on Sinai, and laid down principles to serve as a guide for mankind, principles that are eternally valid. If this people, by its very existence, was a witness to the God who spoke to humanity and took us to himself, then that God finally had to die, and power had to belong to man alone, to those men who thought that by force they had made themselves masters of the world." Unquote. But now something beautiful is occurring, a new kind of relationship based on greater understanding, mutual respect between Christians and Jews. And in the context of this qualitatively new relationship, Hebrew-speaking Catholics who live in Israel not only bring the universal church back to its first origins, but they also operate as a bridge between Christianity and Judaism. The Universal Catholic Church has declared its desire for a new relationship through its official documents. Hebrew-speaking Catholics bear concrete witness to this new longing in their homes, neighborhoods, and communities. They put it into practice and live it. So the witness of Hebrew-speaking Catholics is not only a challenge to Catholic theology, but also a reminder to Catholics worldwide of the importance of not dismissing the Jewish roots of our faith. If you love someone, you want to know their story, who they are, where they grew up, what their family is like, everything you can possibly find out about them. Christians who love Jesus Christ want to find out as much as they can about him. And as Christians, we believe that the unique beauty of Jesus Christ is made up of his humanity as well as his divinity. So encountering and being grasped by the beauty of Jesus Christ is at least partly a matter of becoming familiar with his human and cultural Jewish background, which is why, for instance, millions of Christian pilgrims visit the Holy Land each year. So to conclude, let me sum up. I've taken as my primary examples of Catholic faith and practice worldwide, one, the new practice emanating from Rome of dialogue with agnostics; two, the search for a deeper and broader faith coming from Ireland; and three, the retrieval of our Jewish roots emanating from Hebrew-speaking Catholics in Israel. All around the world, Catholicism needs more than an intellectual approach to things, although it needs also that. We need to find concrete new ways of living the faith in order to build up community, to better journey together. And these grassroots expressions of discipleship can help Catholic theology hone its prophetic edge, enhance its authenticity by helping it seek what is true with its thought, lead to action which is good, delight in beauty, and deepen unity even as it respects each culture in its uniqueness. To adapt a famous phrase from Dostoevsky, the world and theology will be saved by beauty, goodness, truth, and unity. Thank you.
I regret that my teaching responsibilities have led me, unfortunately, to miss most of this conference, but if Father Casey's talk is any indication, I've missed a great deal. I would like to thank Father Casey for his very thoughtful and very rich remarks on the Catholic, small c, nature of Catholicism, large c. I actually, even after reading his talk over twice and then hearing the presentation with the images, I hardly knew where to begin, but I found a place. As a specialist in medieval liturgy, I appreciate especially his affirmation of Catholic theology as shaped by a sacramental vision of reality as pervaded by God's presence. And I will offer my brief reflections to his presentation through a liturgical lens. In structuring my response to his presentation, I write in my paper, I would like to mirror the structure of his comments, but in fact I've shamelessly stolen your opening structure. In place of his 3 I's, ways of seeing Catholic theology in 3 different geographical and cultural locations, I would like to offer 2 T's, which, when blended carefully and brewed properly, can offer a taste of the richness of Catholic theology as rooted in and experienced through the Church's liturgy. The first T that I would like to discuss very briefly is that of time. Again, I did not have access to the images, but the image that comes to my mind as I speak is the initial one of the man digging in the dirt, digging, in a sense, into the past. The variety of cultures that have shaped and been shaped by Catholicism is not limited to the contemporary period. Catholic theology and practice have been reimagined over the centuries across several cultural landscapes. The historical development of the order of Mass in the early Middle Ages is one important example in liturgical practice. Beyond the scriptural witness, the brief description of the Eucharistic celebration found in the first apology of Justin Martyr, circa 150, reflects the influence of both Jewish and Greco-Roman cultural patterns. These descriptions contain a number of what has been called familiar-looking elements, including intercessory prayers, readings from the scriptures, a homily, the bringing and the blessing of bread and cup, and their distribution to the community. Other elements were introduced later, for example, by popes from the 5th through the 7th centuries. For example, the responsorial psalm in the early 5th century and the Agnus Dei in the late 7th century. The structure and texts of the Roman Mass are also adopted and adapted north of the Alps by Germano-Frankish culture. In particular, the order of Mass itself undergoes a complex development, categorized in several stages or types, from the 9th through the 11th centuries. Several ritual moments are elaborated and filled out with private devotional prayer texts and series of versicles and responses recited among the ministers, sometimes with a celebratory, often with a penitential theme. Examples include the vesting rite, the offertory rite, the communion rite, and the prayers after Mass. As my co-author and I have noted in the recent commentary on the order of Mass of the Roman Missal, between the 8th and the 10th centuries, the Mass would transform itself in Frankish and Germanic lands, mixing together the imported Roman liturgy with local patterns of worship. The resulting Romano-Frankish Mass would not remain north of the Alps, but in the 10th century would travel back to Rome and profoundly influence the worship of the eternal city. To fully appreciate the span of time during which this development takes place, it might help to consider this comparison. It is as if the early witnesses to the structure of the Eucharist dated from the time of the Battle of Hastings in 1066, when William the Conqueror, conquered England. And the more complex development in the order of Mass took place between the American Civil War and the Apollo 11 moon landing. This is a considerable span of time, and it is clear that, as Father Casey has put it, Catholicism has huge horizons, culturally, in time, as well as geographically. This hybrid liturgy is essentially the one that Catholics celebrate today worldwide. There are other elaborations, but they would take a longer response to detail. The second T that I would like to explore briefly is translation. Father Casey's discussion of the Lord's Prayer as an avenue into understanding the cultural context of Jesus of Nazareth prompted me to move from the cultural roots of the prayer to an irresistible examination of the fruit the prayer has borne over the centuries. Indeed, one could not find a more interesting or moving marker of the spread of Christianity across time and place. A quick Google search, one of my favorite activities these days, uncovered several sites on the Lord's Prayer, some of which addressed the topic of translations explicitly. The Lord's Prayer has been translated into more than 1,500 languages, and I suspect the number is much higher. Some are past forms of present languages, for example, Middle English or Middle French. Some are in languages that are now extinct, for example, Etruscan. Others are contemporary languages and dialects spoken today on every continent across the face of the globe. The prayer has also been translated into what some call constructed or artificial languages, often designed to facilitate communication across countries and cultures, for example, Esperanto and Interlingua. The most interesting examples are others that include fictional languages. The Lord's Prayer has been translated into the language of the elves, characters in J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings saga, and into the language of the Klingons, an alien race familiar to fans of the Star Trek series. There are no limits to the Catholic sacramental imagination, I suppose, not even the future. My second example again focuses on the Roman Catholic celebration of the Mass. Here my historical perspective will be a bit more circumscribed and a great deal more contemporary. Some 40 years have passed between the implementation of the full English translation of the Missal in 1972 and the present implementation of the English translation of the third edition of the Roman Missal. For 2 generations, English-speaking Catholics have prayed the earlier texts and have internalized the responses and phrasing. It is a testimony to the power of ritual act that it has been so difficult over the past few weeks even to make the simple shift from "and also with you" to "and with your spirit." Can't even do it right now. Even for me, shutting off this automatic response takes a real act of will and concentration, especially in this initial phase of the implementation. In addition, translation is tricky work. It is rarely digital, like a clock display, precise to the second. Translation is more analog, like a dial that needs fine-tuning, in this case, between the completely dynamic and the completely literal that lie at either end. This is especially true of prayer texts, themselves the product of different periods in liturgical history, and expressive both of theological precision and transcendent mystery. To paraphrase Chesterton, writing about the task of Catholic theology, the task of the liturgical translator is to ensure that the puppy of the original prayer text develops into a dog in translation and not transform into a cat. The first English translation was prepared after the immediate impact of the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy and its call for full and active participation of the laity through rites that have been restored to emphasize clarity and simplicity. As the years passed and English-speaking Catholics had a chance to reflect on their experience, some felt that the translation was perhaps too dynamic, the vocabulary and phrasing prosaic and flat. Already at the end of the 1970s, it was clear that the translation should be revisited, and that process has been much longer and more complex than anyone at that time could have suspected. This new English translation of the third edition of the Missal moves the translation dial more to the literal end. Some of the newer, more literal phrasing is more poetic and expresses a richer imagery. For example, from the rising of the sun to its setting, instead of from east to west. Oops. In other ways, the phrasing of the euchology can seem, at first hearing, of some of the euchology, I should say, can seem at first hearing to obscure rather than clarify the meaning of the original Latin. However, the celebration of the liturgy is part of the lived experience of Catholic worship, both on the local as well as the global levels. My own experience has reinforced for me the reality that liturgical translations, especially of the Eucharist, the source and summit of the Church's liturgy, must be lived into. No translation of a liturgical text can be judged as words on a page. Liturgical rites must be enacted, repeated, and made a living, transformative reality throughout the life of a community over time. Among the vernaculars, English is the most widely used language in the world, if one considers not simply the number of native speakers, but the number of countries in which it is used as a primary or secondary language. Thus, preparation of an English translation of the Roman Missal is truly a task with global impact, and it will take time for that translation to be fully interwoven into Father Casey's tapestry of worldwide Catholic faith and practice. Only then will it be time, yet again, to take a step back and evaluate that impact, perhaps with an eye to applying another correction to the translation dial. It may seem that I have strayed a little far afield from Father Casey's presentation. His talk, however, offers answers to the question he initially poses. Why pay attention to the cultural diversity of Catholicism today? I offer these reflections as a way of augmenting his thoughts. The Catholic liturgy, too, can be understood as the consummate expression of and participation in the beauty, goodness, truth, and unity of the salvation offered to the world by the God who calls all times now and all cultures home. Thank you.